Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we are going to be returning to the forests for some tales of campers and the horrors they have witnessed. So get ready, as it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My father used to enjoy going to this camping ground not far from the hometown he grew up in. The campground was in Cavendish, Vermont. It was a place called Catton Place. He enjoyed how peaceful and remote the area was. Having been there a few times, and observing that it was family friendly, he thought it would be nice to bring his daughter with him. Choosing to go around the same time of year that he went the last few times, he saw familiar faces. There was this campsite of 3 men who were out of staters in their mid-40s. Most likely were from Boston because of their accent. They had a big fancy trailer, and the entire site was decked out with a dartboard, hammock, lawn chairs, garden gnomes, and patches of fake grass. From observation, it looked like they were there to stay a few weeks at a time, all settled in, quite comfortable. Too comfortable, actually, to the point where they walk around with a sense of superiority, boastful and loud, like they owned the place. The place was actually run by an elderly couple. These macho-acting goons were quite friendly with them. The year before, they painted the playground for them for free, so the elderly couple loved these guys. My father saw these men around last time, but didn't have to deal with them or worry much about their camp, because it was situated quite far. This time, unfortunately, we were placed quite close to them, with only one empty campsite separating us. We were surrounded by other empty campsites too, but around 30 feet away there was also a middle-aged couple camping out. Here is where the story starts. We arrive and set up our camp. I remember observing those men across from us. My father waved a friendly hello to them, and they waved back. Throughout the day, I played on the playground. By nighttime, we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. Meanwhile, those macho goons across the way were partying hard. Booze everywhere, and blaring tunes on the radio. Lots of laughs and bickering too, but we didn't pay much attention or look over that way, as we were keeping to ourselves. Tired yawns, and we crawled into our tent to sleep, but all the ruckus was still going on. I was able to fall asleep, but my father was not. He laid there for a few hours and kept checking on the time occasionally. It was getting closer to midnight. He wondered if the middle-aged couple nearby were having trouble sleeping over this noise too. Then, the sound can be heard of a vehicle coming down the road. It was the elderly man who owned the place. He stops and lets the men know that there has been a noise complaint. The men apologize profusely and say that they'll be settling in to sleep soon, and the owner leaves. They immediately start cussing and throwing things about their campsite as soon as the owner was out of sight. They were offended that someone had reported them. "Who do you think did it?" one of them asks the other. "Well, it's either the guy with the little girl next to us, or the other couple over there." The other guy responds, and the third guy adds, "I didn't see any of them leave their car to go to the front desk, so one of those people must have a cell phone." This was 1977, so cell phones weren't as common back then. These men had begun conspiring to figure out who owns the cell phone. They weren't trying very hard to speak in hushed tones. because my father could hear everything. "I bet it's the arsehole with the Cadillac who owns the cell phone. I'm going over there," one of them says. They're talking about my father. He does not have a cell phone though. The feeling of pure fear came over him. He had no idea what was going to happen and needed to think fast. The sound of stumbling footsteps came right up, just inches away from our tent. What to do? What to do? My dad thought of making a noise. Any noise. He grabbed the soda can next to him and flicked the top of it with his fingers. The guy was startled and took a step back, and then scurried away back to his drunken buddies. They're now whispering amongst themselves. He can't pick up on what they're saying, but catches the part where they say they're going to try again later. He wonders if he's heard that right. What the hell are these guys trying to do? There's no way my father is going to try and fall asleep now. In fact, he's not feeling tired at all. Hopped up on so much adrenaline right now from the fear. Man with his daughter, feeling helpless. Only a soda can and a flashlight to protect us. My dad lays there frozen, listening, listening, and listening, hoping these guys will just give it up and get some sleep. Sleep off their drunken craziness, as it were. A short time passes, and here comes the footsteps again. Their campfire is so bright that it casts a shadow into our tent. He can literally see the shadow of a man coming towards us. The man doesn't get as close this time, because again, he stops at the noise coming from our tent. My dad had to unzip his sleeping bag in a panic, ready to defend and protect us in case this man was going to try and come into our tent. The man isn't moving anymore. He's just standing there, watching us. My dad remembered he had a lighter in his pocket. He took it out from underneath the blanket, flicked the switch on it, as he was hoping it would mimic the sound of getting a gun ready. I don't think it worked, but the man eventually did turn around and go back to their campsite. "You won't believe this. They're still awake." "What the hell?" they all splutter amongst themselves. Maybe, just maybe, being around 2:30 a.m., they will finally go to sleep. Nope. At this point I'm still asleep, but I'm tossing and turning a lot. My feet slap against the side of the tent a couple of times. The footsteps are approaching us again, while I brush my feet against the side of the tent. "Ugh," the man says, with an exasperated sigh. He starts to walk away, but not to his campsite. He starts walking towards the road, walks a few feet, stops, and then screams at the top of his lungs, "If I find out who reported us, I will kill you. You hear me? I will end you." Everything is still now. Only sounds that can be heard is the crackling of the campfire and the occasional indistinct chatter amongst the men. Then, finally, the sound of their trailer door shuts at 5 a.m. They're asleep. My dad lays there trying to process everything that had happened. By 6 a.m. he wakes me up to pack and get out of there. I remember him rushing me, and I was all confused. My dad then said he's never going camping again. That statement is still true. He never has been camping since. I have so many questions though. What did they want? Why did they need us to be asleep to sneak up on us? Did they want to harm my dad or myself? Did they want to steal the cell phone that he never had? I guess we'll never know. But it's so scary to think about. and I know that my father should have talked to the owners and made a police report too. I'm not sure if it crossed his mind in those moments. I assume that in this sleepless night state of mind, he just wanted to get away, far away, and back to the comfort of his own home. This happened to my grandma in the late 50s. She would have been in her mid-20s. She was camping with her husband and kids. She liked to wake up early to jog before coming back to fix breakfast, just as everyone else was waking up. One time she was jogging on the sidewalk, and a white car pulls up alongside her and says, "A girl as pretty as you shouldn't be out here without her husband. Someone might decide to steal you." She just said that she'd be fine and kept jogging, and the man drove away. A bit further, the sidewalk strays about 20 feet or so into the road. This strip of land between the road and sidewalk is forested, and you could kind of see the road throughout the foliage. The opposite side of the sidewalk was a forest. As she was jogging, she saw a glimpse of a person running from the direction of the road into the forest. It startled her, and she stopped jogging for a second. She looked around and could see pulled over on the side of the road was the car of the guy who talked to her earlier, but the car was empty. She realized that the guy had driven further up the sidewalk, pulled over and hidden in the woods. Of course, she was scared and ran as fast as she could back to her campsite. She said it ruined jogging for her, and she never had the courage to jog alone again for the rest of her life. This happened back in 2012 when I was 15. There is a youth centre in my city that used to do annual camping trips to Sweden. Me and my two friends, Sarah and Michelle, decided to go. The campground was set with an office and a kiosk at the entrance, and all of the caravans and tents behind it. In front of the office was a giant parking lot that you would have to cross to get to the showers and bathrooms. The office was located in one corner, and the bathrooms in the opposite corner furthest away. There were 3 male teachers with us on this trip, all in their mid-20s. Every day, they would take us to a supermarket nearby, in case we wanted something that the kiosk did not sell. While we were in line to pay, we noticed a guy, probably in his early 20s. He was dressed in black cargo pants, big leather boots, and a leather jacket. Despite it being over 30 degrees, but the most noticeable thing about him was his hair, or lack thereof. He had no hair, no eyebrows, and no eyelashes. He looked like he had gone through chemotherapy. We kind of felt sorry for him because he was so young, and we talked about him on our way back. When we got back, we hung out a bit, just chilling in the lake, before we went to the kiosk to buy something to drink. When we saw the guy again, we thought it was a coincidence, even though there weren't that many people on the campsite. He could very well be living there. Later that afternoon, Sarah had to use the bathroom, and because it was so far away and slightly deserted, me and Michelle went with her. There was a bench and a table just outside the cabin that held the bathrooms, and guess who was sitting there? The same guy from earlier. He was sitting there with 3 friends, 2 girls and a guy. And when we got close enough, he stood up and looked like he wanted to say something. Sarah and Michelle, who have always been a bit paranoid, sped up and went into the bathroom. But I hung back a bit and asked if he wanted anything. He looked after my friends and started shaking his head and sat back down. I kind of stood there for a few seconds because he looked so sad before joining my friends. Me and Michelle sat in the changing room adjacent to the bathroom, and after a couple of minutes, one of the girls from outside came in and started speaking to us in Swedish. Even though the Scandinavian languages are quite similar to each other, it can still be challenging to understand. So we spent a few minutes explaining that we weren't Swedish before she started speaking broken English. She told us that her friend, the bald guy, was very shy, and if we wanted to go and speak with him for a few minutes. Now, we were 3 girls in a foreign country, and he was at least a couple of years older than us. We didn't want to speak with him, and we told her this. She was talking to us for more than 20 minutes. At the start, she wanted us to just have a chat with him. Then she wanted one of us to go into his tent with him. Then she asked us to sleep with him. At this point, she was very frantic and just kept switching from Swedish to English, so it was kind of hard to understand. But she said in Swedish, "You just need to sleep with him. If you don't do it, he'll do it to me." At this point, Sarah was finally done in the bathroom and came out to see what was happening. The girl looked like she was about to cry and left the room. Sarah wanted to see who it was, so we all looked out the little window, and I'm glad that we did. We saw the girl say something to the guy. He looked over to the bathroom door and slammed his fists onto the table, got up, and walked over to the door. We didn't know what to do, because he was blocking the only exit, so we all went into the little bathroom and locked the door. We heard the guy knocking on the door to the changing room, and we all held our breaths. After a while he knocked again, but we still kept quiet, not even moving. After a while, we heard the door open, but he was clearly trying to be quiet about it. He slowly walked towards the bathroom door, and all we could hear was the heavy sound of his boots on the floor. He sat down just outside the door, and just sat there for 45 minutes. We could hear his heavy breathing on the other side of the door for those 45 minutes. We didn't care about how much noise we made. We already knew we were there. We tried to find the number for the Swedish police, but we didn't have any service on our phones, because we were in a different country, and we didn't have our teacher's number, so we couldn't call them. We just sat there panicking for the most part. Suddenly he got up, kicked the door and walked outside again. We were dead quiet, and didn't move for another 10 minutes, scared that he was trying to lure us out. All of a sudden, the door opened again, and we could hear someone fumbling with something, either keys or some tools. We were afraid that he had found something to open the door with, but then we remembered that there was this little box that you could put money into to get the showers started. We asked who it was, and someone responded, "The janitor," or something akin to that. I was kind of in shock and didn't hear properly, to be honest. We took a chance and slowly opened the door, ready to close it again quickly if it were him. The man on the other side wasn't the same guy though, as he was at least 60. We asked him if he saw the other guy, and he told us he'd told him to leave, as he had seen him leave the girls' changing room. We thanked the man and started walking towards the office. We were met there by the owner, and she quickly got our teachers there. We were all very shocked, so it was hard to get the words out of us, but in the end, we managed to tell our teachers what had happened. All the teachers were outraged, and 2 of them immediately left to see if they could find the guy. That night, the police came to talk with us and told us that "sleep with" in Swedish means the exact same thing it does in English. and the fact that the girl said that he was going to do it to her really showed his intentions. The police never found the guy, but we discovered that the two teachers that went to look for him did find him. We overheard a conversation between the teachers, and apparently they threatened him so bad he almost cried. I understand why. The teachers were both quite tall and strong. For the longest time, I still got the creeps every time I saw a bald guy. This happened when I was in the 8th grade. When I was around 14, I studied a subject focusing on outdoor pursuits. For our final assessment, 2 teachers took my class on a one-night camp where we would do activities like rock climbing, kayaking, trail walking, etc. I live in Australia, around an hour from a state forest that was notorious for the backpacker murders. Several bodies have been found, and several more remain missing. I'm pretty sure that all of the murders were linked to the same serial killer. Anyway, in the morning we leave the school and drive out in a bus. When we reach the road that leads to the entrance of the forest, a police car is parked to the side. He spoke to the teacher for a moment, but I didn't hear anything, and no one else seemed to notice or care. Fast forward a few hours, and we've trekked, roughly 20 of us, to the camping area somewhere in the middle of the state forest. Some parts are state, some are privately owned. While kayaking that afternoon, we noticed a helicopter doing flybys, but again, my classmates never suspected anything. A couple of mates and I were the first to leave the water, and helped the teacher with some equipment, and started building our own rafts. I was standing off to the side when one of the national park guides walked over to one of the instructors and talked in a hushed, slightly stressed out tone. I remember hearing the instructor say stuff like, "You're kidding," and "I don't believe it." He just looked shocked and taken aback. So at this point I started connecting the dots, but I didn't say anything to my school friends. Around dusk that night, I go to use the toilet block, which is around 100 meters from my campsite. As I go in, I remember a guy walking around the other side of the block. I didn't see him very clearly in the diminished light, but he kept glancing around with nervous body language. I couldn't see his face clearly. He wasn't part of our party, and to me he just didn't fit in. But I didn't think much of it at the time. Fast forward to the next morning when we get back to the car park. The teacher tells us that a body was found in a dam not too far from where we were. They didn't want to tell us as to not to frighten us. We later found out it was a young guy who was killed with an axe, and the guy who did it was related to the serial killer who hunted in the same area. I don't know if it was the guy I'd seen, or if he had anything to do with the murders, but it freaked me out a lot afterwards, and I haven't been camping since. I guess the best way to start this story is to start from the beginning and recount the incident as clearly as possible, or at least as clearly as I can recall after 25 years. In the early 1990s, a friend and I went on a camping trip in the Royal National Park just south of Sydney, Australia. The campground we chose was truly in the middle of nowhere, and one we'd been to a number of times before, and as a result, we knew exactly where we wanted to set up camp. From the car park, which was nearly empty, you would walk down a long bush track, down the side of a mountain, until you reached the bottom and came to a beach, at the right of which was a cabin area of the campground, which had 1 or 2 people in there. However, if you turned left, There was a very large grassy plain with a number of rolling green hills. The last of these hills before a second vast green field had a point where the land came to a cliff overlooking the ocean. The downside of this hill was covered in trees, so you'd have to follow the top of the hill inland until you came to a small path through the trees leading down to a second field, which was surrounded by a forest. On the far side of this field was a small alcove in the walls of trees which made a perfect windbreak and was a 10-meter walk to the beach. This was our preferred campsite, and we'd been there a number of times before. By the time we reached our destination, it was just after 2 p.m. We set up camp, walked to the beach, had a swim, and were just milling around our camp, starting to get ready for the night ahead. It was at this point we decided to start to get our campfire ready to light. We had done a bit of camping before, but weren't what you'd consider experienced outdoorsmen. For example, if we didn't have matches or a lighter, we would have no way of starting a fire. It was at this point that we realized the matches we had brought on our way to the campground were still in the center console of our car. We tossed a coin, and I lost, so I started the long trek back to the car to get them. By the time I did and got back down to the path to the forest field, it was now an hour or so until sunset, so it would be dark by the time I got back to camp. I did have my heavy-duty flashlight, you know the kind, black metal cylinder body, the ones that are favored by law enforcement departments around the world, so I could see where I was going. It was sturdy and reliable, and doubled up as a weapon if I ever found myself in a situation where I was in need of one. I reached the last hill as I found the path through the trees and made my way down to the second field. When I cleared the trees, I found my friend standing there. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he'd come to help me, since I was obviously having some trouble. I asked him what he meant, and he said he'd seen my flashlight beam sweeping around the top of the hill for at least half an hour or so. I told him I'd only reached the path a few minutes ago, so it couldn't have been me. He was looking past me towards the top of a hill, when he suddenly says, "Who else was up there?" "No one," I reply. "So where's that light coming from?" I turned around, and sure enough at the top of the hill, I can see a beam of light swinging back and forth. I knew no one was up there. I'd just been up there, and it was a field with nowhere to hide. I shone my flashlight up in that direction, and the light suddenly went away. Almost as soon as that happened, my flashlight died. It had been working properly up until a second beforehand, but as soon as I aimed it towards the top of that hill, it stopped working. But that wasn't the strangest thing that happened. Not even close. As we're standing on the edge of the trees, looking up where the lights had been, we suddenly became aware of a building standing on the edge of the cliff. This couldn't be. There was no building here. There had never been a building here. We'd been here at least 4 times before, and there had never been anything on that cliff that remotely resembled a building. Even if there had been, I would have seen it when I was up there just 5 minutes before. We stood staring at it, trying to figure out exactly what we were looking at, when suddenly we noticed a couple of silhouettes moving around it. They moved to the building, past it, to the cliff, and back again. As they reached the side of the building closest to us, the silhouettes in the building faded away. They just vanished. Gone. We looked at each other, trying to figure out what we had just seen, when my flashlight came back on. This did nothing to help our nerves. We quickly turned around and hurried back across the field to our campsite. Once we had our campfire lit and had eaten, we sat around the fire and talked about what we had seen. Neither of us had any way of explaining what had happened. Hallucination? How could we have a shared hallucination? What would we tell people that would make us not sound crazy? We couldn't think of a way to relay our story, so we decided there and then to never tell anyone what we knew. We didn't need to. We could live quite happily, only talking about it amongst ourselves. The next day we packed up our camp and headed back to the car. As we passed that spot where the building would have been, we stopped to investigate, and there were no physical signs of anything ever having been there. The grass was long and undisturbed. You could see where I had walked through it the night before, and we carried on. Got back into the car and drove the hour back home in almost complete silence. We occasionally discussed this incident a few times, but as time went by, we both tried to forget it. It wasn't until my friend's death that I started thinking about it again. I thought that maybe the anonymity of the internet would help me feel comfortable sharing this story. I still have never been back to that campsite. Just telling this story puts me on edge. But that's just stupid. Things like this can't exist. Can they? I went on my first solo camping trip when I was 21. I took my miniature dachshund with me, stayed in a remote campground where there was hardly anyone. In the middle of the night, I was woken up several times by the sound of chanting, yelling, and singing from across the river, not in the campground itself, but within hearing distance. Freaked out, I snuggled up to my dog and finally fell asleep with her on my chest. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a jolt and a chill going through my body. I opened my eyes, tipped my head back, and looked through the tiny square vent in the tent directly behind my head. An older man's face was looking at me through the tent window. A man with long black hair and big black eyes. I was so terrified that I couldn't move. I couldn't even make a sound, and I certainly tried. At some point, my dog, a miniature dachshund, sensed my tension and woke up too. She was still sleeping smack dab in the center of my chest. She looked out the window directly at whatever it was that was behind me and let out a single, sharp, growling bark. The moment she barked, my body relaxed, and I was able to move again. And I realized I may have been asleep and experiencing sleep paralysis the whole time. There was nobody behind the tent anymore. It was very possible that it was a very realistic, freaky dream. Or did my dog save me? It was the summer after 7th grade. My mother had signed me up for church camp, which would result in both wonderful and terrifying events. I was the definition of a teenager at this point. My hormones were all over, just like my acne, and I wanted nothing more than a boyfriend. As the church bus loaded up, I noticed someone who I had never seen around before. He was tall and slender, with nice hair. His name was Chris. I might add that upon that first glance, I was well aware that he was out of my league. After arriving at the camp's destination, the whole, maybe 8 of us, were already well acquainted. We would go on to be somewhat of a group the entire time. There were many other churches at the camp, and not all of them were like ours. Many of the girls were mean, and there was definitely a group of jocks. The sermon for the week was centered around heroes, and how you could be someone's hero. It encouraged us to reach out and become friends with people who didn't have any. It was much more of an anti-bullying session than a Bible lesson. A couple of days go by, and our group had become much tighter. It is down to about 3 of us that are inseparable, and Chris is one of them. I still think highly of him at this point, and undoubtedly my self-esteem cannot see him any more than a friend. While we're on break, my group of friends notice a kid that is all alone. He is very thin, with a head full of blonde curls. We know right off the bat that he's strange. His name is Nathan. Nathan was indeed lonely, and the week was about being a hero, so we go ahead and invite him to sit down with us at lunch. Looking back, now I can identify some very disturbing characteristics about Nathan. At lunch that day, he wasn't interested in his food. He was too busy catching moths in the window of the cafeteria. After he'd caught one, he showed us how they acted when he pulled their legs and wings from their bodies. He mutilated about 4 bugs in the time that he was meant to be spent eating. And his plate remained untouched. Nathan was especially fond of me. I didn't find him attractive, so I was oblivious to the fact that he was very into me. He was never 3 feet away from me after that lunch. He sat next to me during every sermon, and was what I now know as clingy. He would even go as far as to walk with me to the restroom and wait for me during break. The camp decided one day to do a special Bible study. It was broken up by church, so we went back to the 3 amigos. I don't know how or why, but Chris started to separate me from our 3rd friend at this time. By the time the Bible study was over, it was around 8 p.m. It was dark, and we still had to walk back from the forest. Chris walked next to me, and by my surprise grabbed my hand. The butterflies in my tummy were climbing up my esophagus. I was ecstatic, to say the least. I believe he asked me to be his girlfriend shortly after. There was one more boy at church camp, and his name was Joe. He was not part of our friend group, but I still managed to speak with him a few times. He had a girlfriend called Kate. I think I was friends with Joe because he had given me a cigarette, which we smoked in complete secrecy. When we came back from the woods, Kate saw us together, and decided from that moment on that she would hate me. However, there was more bad blood. Nathan soon found out that Chris and I were an item, and did not speak to me at all afterwards. But it didn't keep him from watching me. Every time I looked up, whether it was in sermon or on break, he was staring. I thought I was safe because I was at church, and I would soon find out that I was not. It was the very last night off church camp. There was a huge concert, and it was almost magical. My heart was heavy to leave. At this point, Chris takes me by the hand and we go into the woods. I saw my first shooting star that night, and I also kissed my first boyfriend under the moon in an almost surreal atmosphere. While I was undergoing the greatest moment of my youth, Nathan was out for revenge. He knew that Kate was not my biggest fan, and that night he gave her a handwritten note to put under my pillow. As every teenage girl is, she was nosy. She read what was a death threat, as well as a promise of sexual assault, and chose not to follow through with his intentions. She passed it to Joe, who gave it to the pastors. From there, the police were called, and Nathan ended up in a mental asylum. My parents were contacted. My father, who was a construction worker his entire life, told me that it was the most gruesome thing he'd ever read or heard, and my mother was in tears. I ended up going to court and got a restraining order against Nathan. Fast forward a year, and I was now no longer dating Chris. I'm pretty rambunctious to say the least, and having nightmares regularly about Nathan and his letter to me. My parents and the police refused to tell me what was said, so I went to someone else who had read it, Joe. Joe told me he was in town one night and agreed to see me. I snuck out of my house to meet with him. I got into his car and he started driving. Joe did not take me home that night. In fact, Joe was a few years older than me, and I would go as far as to say he kidnapped me. As much as I begged, he wouldn't take me home. He tried to sleep with me that night. Luckily, after I cried enough, he decided to give up. The next morning, he was contacted by the police. They were about 10 minutes from sending out an Amber Alert by the time, and I was finally taken home. The worst part is, I still have nightmares. Joe never told me what the letter said, although he had promised me he would. He only told me that one line that was fresh in his memory: "I will punch out all your teeth and shove my thing down your throat until you can't breathe." Church camp ruined me. Nathan and Joe, let's not meet. A year ago, a group of us went camping in Kearney, Ontario, where we always go camping. Whenever we go, we always form our tents in a big circle, with the fire pit in the middle of us. We've been drinking, smoking a few joints, and a few of us were tripping balls on shrooms. The first night we were there, this guy randomly walks into our circle, introduces himself, and says that he was in the military and decided to take some vacation to camp out for a bit. He asked if he could join our fire, as it was getting late and he didn't buy any firewood. Being the friendly, stoned people we are, we let him join our fire. He even pitched in some money for the firewood. The night went on, and we were all having a good time. One by one, our group started heading off to bed, me being either the second or third. I remember waking up to the sound of someone talking and the fire being started. It was 4 a.m, and I peeped out my tent and saw the random just sitting on a log by the fire, talking to himself. Still tripping on shrooms, I thought to myself that I was in no condition to deal with this and chalked it up to just me tripping out. I wake up the next day, and everyone is thankfully still alive, and the fire is smouldering. We look to the next campsite, where the random was staying, and it was spotless. No garbage, no tracks in the trail around the site, no nothing. We started talking about him just to be sure we all saw him. Through talking, we managed to figure out that he must not have slept at all. The last 2 of our group passed out just after 3:30. The first person got up just after 6 and noticed he was gone. The rest of our camping trip went well, and we all went home. Fast forward maybe 4 to 5 years. I flip on the news, and there's a picture of someone I could swear I recognize. He was arrested for a bunch of crimes, including sexual assault and murder. Guess who it was? It was the random guy who joined our fire. I don't know why I remembered his face, but I guess it was just a weird situation where my brain right-clicked and saved a JPEG in my brain. Now, I have no way of proving if it was the same guy. We didn't take any pictures of the random, but the picture jump started my memory and made me instantly remember the weird random fire joiner. Either that, or they looked identical. Either way, it was profoundly creepy. I was camping at a popular campground in the mountains with my boyfriend, but it was November, and it was their last open weekend, so no one was there. We were chatting and having a good time around the campfire and drinking. My boyfriend has to go pee, so he walked to the other side of the road and peed in the bushes. While over there, he very slowly and quietly got my attention and pointed out the large glowing eyes staring back at him from the bushes. He still has his wiener out while in the stare-off with the mountain lion. We very carefully backed up and stayed really close to the fire until we went to bed in the car instead of the tent. We could hear it walking around after. The worst part was, I went to find the pit toilet 15 minutes before this happened, by myself. I even got slightly lost while trying to find it, and was probably being stalked by the cougar. I've been pretty nervous camping ever since. This happened to me a few years ago, and I can really say it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Me and some friends were camping on a small island close to the mainland. Here in Norway during summer, it doesn't really get dark. We basically just have different shades of grey during the night. Around 5 in the morning, me and a friend were up, talking close to the water, huddled up in our sleeping bags, drinking some Jägermeister. Covering the water is a thick mist. As the sun is rising, both me and my friend could swear that the mist is moving. We're there speechless, just watching the theatre unfold. You could see moving people on the water, kind of like walking or floating. They were all moving in one direction. Some of them were going in circles. The only thing that you could really see were the outlines of the figures. It was really peaceful as they were slowly migrating from one place to another. Both of us were talking a bit, and we could both see the same people. On one hand, they were just outlines, but on the other, they all had really clear characteristics. When I think back, it was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's installment of camping stories. They are always some of my favorite. If you liked today's video, please don't forget to drop a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and press subscribe if you're new here. The like button could always use with a click too. Don't forget that if you have a story to share, you can send it to my email or post it to my Reddit. Either are fine. And it will make its way into a video soon, assuming that it has plenty of description, paragraphing, and punctuation, as those are the key things I look for when choosing the stories I will narrate. But anyway, for now guys, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.